I was 3 days into what should have been the most romantic week of my life when I found the medical consent forms hidden in David's luggage. Not the normal travel documents or insurance papers you'd expect to find, but detailed surgical authorization forms with my name already signed in handwriting that looked suspiciously like mine. The forms were in Spanish, but my 4 years of college Spanish were enough to understand the words that made my blood run cold: extracción de riñón and donante vivo, kidney extraction, living donor. My hands trembled as I held the papers, sitting on the marble floor of our honeymoon suite at Casa Blanca Resort in Cabo San Lucas. David was downstairs at the pool bar, probably charming the bartender with his pharmaceutical sales pitch routine, completely unaware that his new wife had just discovered his plan to harvest her organs on their honeymoon. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd married a man who literally wanted to sell me for parts. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that cut deep enough. It was the realization that this explained everything. David's insistence on this specific resort, his mysterious appointments with business contacts he claimed were in pharmaceutical distribution, his sudden interest in my medical history and blood type, and, most chilling of all, his gentle suggestions that I should take it easy and avoid alcohol for the past month to stay healthy for our honeymoon. He'd been preparing my body like livestock. I sat there in the air-conditioned silence of our suite, surrounded by the rose petals and champagne bottles that had seemed so romantic just hours before, and felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not tears, but something colder and more dangerous. Because what David didn't know, what he couldn't have known when he chose me as his victim, was that I wasn't just some naive medical research coordinator who'd fallen for his charm. I was Sofia Martinez's daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My mother had been a federal prosecutor who specialized in medical crimes and organ trafficking before she died in a car accident 5 years ago. She'd taught me from a young age that the most dangerous predators are the ones who make you feel safe first. She'd also taught me to always have a backup plan, to document everything, and to never let anyone know how much you really understand until you're ready to strike. Most importantly, she'd left me with connections in law enforcement that David could never imagine. The medical consent forms weren't even the most damning evidence I'd found. Over the past 3 months, I'd been quietly documenting David's behavior, following my mother's advice to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. The late-night phone calls he took in Spanish, thinking I couldn't understand. The encrypted messages on his phone that he thought he'd deleted. The medical equipment deliveries to our house that he claimed were, quote, samples for clients. The mysterious cash deposits in an account I wasn't supposed to know about. I'd been building a case against my own husband without even knowing what the case was for. Now, holding these surgical consent forms, everything clicked into place like puzzle pieces, forming a picture I'd been too close to see. David hadn't fallen in love with me at that pharmaceutical. I was 3 days into what should have been the most romantic week of my life when I found the medical consent forms hidden in David's luggage. Not the normal travel documents or insurance papers you'd expect to find, but detailed surgical authorization forms with my name already signed in handwriting that looked suspiciously like mine. The forms were in Spanish, but my 4 years of college Spanish were enough to understand the words that made my blood run cold: extracción de riñón and donante vivo, kidney extraction, living donor. My hands trembled as I held the papers, sitting on the marble floor of our honeymoon suite at Casa Blanca Resort in Cabo San Lucas. David was downstairs at the pool bar, probably charming the bartender with his pharmaceutical sales pitch routine, completely unaware that his new wife had just discovered his plan to harvest her organs on their honeymoon. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd married a man who literally wanted to sell me for parts. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that cut deep enough. It was the realization that this explained everything. David's insistence on this specific resort, his mysterious appointments with business contacts he claimed were in pharmaceutical distribution, his sudden interest in my medical history and blood type, and most chilling of all, his gentle suggestions that I should take it easy and avoid alcohol for the past month to stay healthy for our honeymoon. He'd been preparing my body like livestock. I sat there in the air-conditioned silence of our suite, surrounded by the rose petals and champagne bottles that had seemed so romantic just hours before, and felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not tears, but something colder and more dangerous. Because what David didn't know, what he couldn't have known when he chose me as his victim, was that I wasn't just some naive medical research coordinator who'd fallen for his charm. I was Sofia Martinez's daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My mother had been a federal prosecutor who specialized in medical crimes and organ trafficking before she died in a car accident 5 years ago. She'd taught me from a young age that the most dangerous predators are the ones who make you feel safe first. She'd also taught me to always have a backup plan, to document everything, and to never let anyone know how much you really understand until you're ready to strike. Most importantly, she'd left me with connections in law enforcement that David could never imagine. The medical consent forms weren't even the most damning evidence I'd found. Over the past 3 months, I'd been quietly documenting David's behavior, following my mother's advice to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. The late-night phone calls he took in Spanish, thinking I couldn't understand. The encrypted messages on his phone that he thought he'd deleted. The medical equipment deliveries to our house that he claimed were samples for clients. The mysterious cash deposits in an account I wasn't supposed to know about. I'd been building a case against my own husband without even knowing what the case was for. Now, holding these surgical consent forms, everything clicked into place like puzzle pieces, forming a picture I'd been too close to see. David hadn't fallen in love with me at that pharmaceutical. Wrong? Where are you? I'm in Cabo San Lucas with my husband, and I have evidence that he's involved in organ trafficking. I think he's planning to remove my kidney. The words sounded insane even as I said them, but Ray didn't question me. Send me everything you have right now. Photos, documents, location information. I'm gonna make some calls. How much time do we have? I don't know. He just left to meet with his contacts. The consent forms I found suggest surgery was planned for tomorrow morning. Jess, listen to me carefully. Do not eat or drink anything he gives you. Do not go anywhere alone with him. If you can safely get to the resort's front desk, tell them you need to speak with local police about a medical emergency. I'm going to contact our attaché in Mexico City and get federal agents involved. I was already uploading the photos to our secure server. Ray, there's something else. I've been documenting his behavior for months. I have recordings, financial records, everything. I think this is bigger than just me. Good girl. Your mother trained you well. I'll have people there within hours, but until then, you need to stay safe and play along. Can you do that? Yes, I said, and I meant it. I can do that. After hanging up, I sat in the silence of the suite and felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. For months, I'd been living with the nagging feeling that something was wrong with my marriage, that David's love felt more like an investment than genuine emotion. I'd questioned my own instincts, wondered if I was being paranoid, worried that I was sabotaging my own happiness. Now I knew the truth, and the truth, however horrible, was better than living in uncertainty. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Meeting running long. Order room service if you're hungry. See you tonight. Love you. I stared at those 2 words at the end of the message. Love you. How do you tell someone you love them while planning to carve out their organs? How do you kiss someone goodnight knowing you're going to drug them in the morning and sell their body parts to the highest bidder? I thought about my mother then, about the cases she'd worked and the stories she'd told me about human trafficking and medical crimes. She'd always said that the worst criminals were the ones who made you feel safe first, who gained your trust before they destroyed you. She'd taught me that evil often wore a familiar face, that it smiled and brought you flowers and told you it loved you right up until the moment it didn't need you anymore. But she'd also taught me that knowledge was power, that documentation was everything, and that the system could work if you understood how to use it. She'd given me the tools to protect myself, even from this. I spent the next hour going through everything David had brought to Mexico, photographing documents, recording serial numbers on medical equipment he'd hidden in his luggage, and uploading everything to the secure server Ray had set up for me. By the time I was finished, I had enough evidence to bury David and whatever operation he was working with. When he returned to the suite that evening, I was ready. I'd taken a shower, put on a pretty dress, and arranged myself on the bed like the perfect unsuspecting wife. I'd even dabbed some of the blue cocktail on my lips to make it look like I'd been drinking it. "Hey, sleepyhead," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Feeling better?" "Much better," I said, stretching languidly. I think I was just overwhelmed by everything. This place is so beautiful, and I can't believe we're actually married. His smile looked genuine, but I could see him checking for signs that I'd consumed the sedative. "I'm glad you're feeling better. Tomorrow's gonna be a big day." "Oh? What do you have planned?" "It's a surprise," he said, and the way he said it made my skin crawl. "But I think you'll find it life-changing." I laughed, the sound light and carefree. I love surprises. Should I be excited? "You should be prepared," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me glad I had federal agents on the way. But don't worry about that now. Let's just enjoy tonight. We ordered room service and ate dinner on the balcony overlooking the ocean. David was charming and attentive, telling me stories about his day and asking about mine. He was such a good actor that if I hadn't found the consent forms, if I hadn't been documenting his behavior for months, I might have believed this was just a normal honeymoon dinner with my loving husband. But I knew better now. I knew that every gentle touch was calculated, every loving word was manipulation, and every smile was a lie. I knew that while he was holding my hand and telling me how beautiful I looked in the sunset, he was mentally preparing to cut me open in the morning. As we sat there watching the waves crash against the shore, I thought about all the women who hadn't been as lucky as me. All the wives and girlfriends and daughters who'd trusted the wrong person and paid for it with their lives. All the victims who hadn't had a federal prosecutor for a mother, who hadn't learned to document everything, who hadn't known to call for help. I thought about my mother, about how proud she'd be that I'd used everything she taught me to protect myself. She'd always said that the best way to honor the victims was to make sure their stories helped save others. Tomorrow, when the federal agents arrived and David's operation was exposed, a lot of potential victims would be saved. But tonight, I had to keep playing the role of the unsuspecting wife. I had to let David believe he was in control, that his plan was working, that tomorrow morning he'd be able to drug me and deliver me to whatever medical facility he'd arranged. I had to be the perfect victim right up until the moment I wasn't. "You know what?" I said, curling up against his shoulder as we watched the stars come out. "I'm so grateful we found each other. I feel so safe with you." David's arm tightened around me, and I felt him relax in a way that told me he believed he'd won. "I'm grateful too," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone like you." I smiled in the darkness, thinking about the federal agents who were probably already on their way to Mexico, about the evidence I'd uploaded to the secure server, about the justice that was coming for David and everyone he worked with. He was right about one thing. Tomorrow was going to be a big day, just not the kind of day he was expecting. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that makes everything look deceptively perfect. I woke to find David already dressed in crisp khakis and a polo shirt, the kind of outfit that screamed, "Trustworthy American tourist." He was standing by the window, speaking quietly into his phone in rapid Spanish. When he noticed I was awake, he quickly ended the call and turned to me with that practiced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, languidly. I think I was just overwhelmed by everything. This place is so beautiful, and I can't believe we're actually married. His smile looked genuine, but I could see him checking for signs that I'd consumed the sedative. "I'm glad you're feeling better. Tomorrow's gonna be a big day." "Oh? What do you have planned?" "It's a surprise," he said, and the way he said it made my skin crawl. "But I think you'll find it life-changing." I laughed, the sound light and carefree. "I love surprises. Should I be excited?" "You should be prepared," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me glad I had federal agents on the way. But don't worry about that now. Let's just enjoy tonight. We ordered room service and ate dinner on the balcony overlooking the ocean. David was charming and attentive, telling me stories about his day and asking about mine. He was such a good actor that if I hadn't found the consent forms, if I hadn't been documenting his behavior for months, I might have believed this was just a normal honeymoon dinner with my loving husband. But I knew better now. I knew that every gentle touch was calculated, every loving word was manipulation, and every smile was a lie. I knew that while he was holding my hand and telling me how beautiful I looked in the sunset, he was mentally preparing to cut me open in the morning. As we sat there watching the waves crash against the shore, I thought about all the women who hadn't been as lucky as me. All the wives and girlfriends and daughters who'd trusted the wrong person and paid for it with their lives. All the victims who hadn't had a federal prosecutor for a mother, who hadn't learned to document everything, who hadn't known to call for help. I thought about my mother, about how proud she'd be that I'd used everything she taught me to protect myself. She'd always said that the best way to honor the victims was to make sure their stories helped save others. Tomorrow, when the federal agents arrived and David's operation was exposed, a lot of potential victims would be saved. But tonight, I had to keep playing the role of the unsuspecting wife. I had to let David believe he was in control, that his plan was working, that tomorrow morning he'd be able to drug me and deliver me to whatever medical facility he'd arranged. I had to be the perfect victim right up until the moment I wasn't. "You know what?" I said, curling up against his shoulder as we watched the stars come out. "I'm so grateful we found each other. I feel so safe with you." David's arm tightened around me, and I felt him relax in a way that told me he believed he'd won. "I'm grateful too," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone like you." I smiled in the darkness, thinking about the federal agents who were probably already on their way to Mexico, about the evidence I'd uploaded to the secure server, about the justice that was coming for David and everyone he worked with. He was right about one thing. Tomorrow was going to be a big day. Just not the kind of day he was expecting. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that makes everything look deceptively perfect. I woke to find David already dressed in crisp khakis and a polo shirt, the kind of outfit that screamed, trustworthy American tourist. He was standing by the window, speaking quietly into his phone in rapid Spanish. When he noticed I was awake, he quickly ended the call and turned to me with that practiced tablecloth. "Oh no, I'm so clumsy. I'm sorry, David." For a split second, David's mask slipped completely. Pure rage flashed across his face, the kind of fury that comes from having your carefully laid plans disrupted. Then he caught himself, but not before I'd seen the real man underneath the charming exterior. "It's okay," he said through gritted teeth. "Accidents happen. Let me call room service for more juice." "Don't worry about it," I said quickly. "I'll just have some water. We should probably get going if we don't want to be late." I could see David calculating, trying to figure out how to get more sedatives into me without raising suspicion. The plan was falling apart, and he knew it. But he was committed now, probably had people waiting at the medical facility, money changing hands, equipment prepared. He couldn't back out. "You know what?" he said, his tone artificially casual. "Why don't we stop for coffee on the way? There's a great little cafe near the medical center." "Perfect," I said, knowing full well that any coffee he bought me would be drugged beyond recognition. "Just let me grab my purse." As I moved around the room collecting my things, I could feel David's growing agitation. His plan required me to be unconscious, or at least heavily sedated before we reached the medical facility. A tour was just the cover story. The reality was that I was supposed to be wheeled in on a gurney, prepped for surgery, and wake up missing a kidney if I woke up at all. I made sure to take my phone, and as I slipped it into my purse, I quickly checked for messages from Detective Williams. There was one, time-stamped just 20 minutes ago. "Team en route. ETA, 2 hours. Stay safe. Do not go to secondary location if possible." 2 hours. I needed to stall David for 2 more hours without making him suspicious enough to abandon the plan entirely, or desperate enough to try something violent in the hotel room. "Ready?" David asked, and I noticed he'd put on a light jacket despite the warm weather, probably to conceal whatever tools or weapons he thought he might need. "Ready?" I said, taking his offered arm and letting him lead me toward the door. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless. David kept checking his watch and his phone, his anxiety bleeding through despite his attempts to maintain the loving husband facade. Other hotel guests smiled at us, probably thinking we were just another happy couple on their honeymoon. If only they knew they were sharing an elevator with a man who was planning to sell his wife's organs. "You know," I said conversationally as we walked through the lobby, "I should probably call my sister and let her know we're okay. She worries when she doesn't hear from me." David's grip on my arm tightened. "Let's wait until after the tour. I want you to be able to focus on what Dr. Vega is showing us." Of course, I agreed, but I made a mental note that David didn't want me communicating with anyone back home. Probably because missing person reports would complicate his timeline. The resort's valet brought around a black SUV with tinted windows. Not the rental car we'd been using for our tourist activities, but something that looked more official, more medical. David helped me into the passenger seat with exaggerated gentleness, the kind of care you show to someone you're about to betray. As we pulled away from the resort, I noticed David taking a route I didn't recognize. We weren't heading toward the main tourist areas of Cabo, but inland, toward a tablecloth. "Oh no, I'm so clumsy. I'm sorry, David." For a split second, David's mask slipped completely. Pure rage flashed across his face, the kind of fury that comes from having your carefully laid plans disrupted. Then he caught himself, but not before I'd seen the real man underneath the charming exterior. "It's okay," he said through gritted teeth. "Accidents happen. Let me call room service for more juice." "Don't worry about it," I said quickly. "I'll just have some water. We should probably get going if we don't want to be late." I could see David calculating, trying to figure out how to get more sedatives into me without raising suspicion. The plan was falling apart, and he knew it. But he was committed now, probably had people waiting at the medical facility, money changing hands, equipment prepared. He couldn't back out. "You know what?" he said, his tone artificially casual. "Why don't we stop for coffee on the way? There's a great little cafe near the medical center." "Perfect," I said, knowing full well that any coffee he bought me would be drugged beyond recognition. "Just let me grab my purse." As I moved around the room collecting my things, I could feel David's growing agitation. His plan required me to be unconscious, or at least heavily sedated before we reached the medical facility. A tour was just the cover story. The reality was that I was supposed to be wheeled in on a gurney, prepped for surgery, and wake up missing a kidney if I woke up at all. I made sure to take my phone, and as I slipped it into my purse, I quickly checked for messages from Detective Williams. There was one, time-stamped just 20 minutes ago. "Team en route. ETA, 2 hours. Stay safe. Do not go to secondary location if possible." 2 hours. I needed to stall David for 2 more hours without making him suspicious enough to abandon the plan entirely, or desperate enough to try something violent in the hotel room. "Ready?" David asked, and I noticed he'd put on a light jacket despite the warm weather, probably to conceal whatever tools or weapons he thought he might need. "Ready?" I said, taking his offered arm and letting him lead me toward the door. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless. David kept checking his watch and his phone, his anxiety bleeding through despite his attempts to maintain the loving husband facade. Other hotel guests smiled at us, probably thinking we were just another happy couple on their honeymoon. If only they knew they were sharing an elevator with a man who was planning to sell his wife's organs. "You know," I said conversationally as we walked through the lobby, "I should probably call my sister and let her know we're okay. She worries when she doesn't hear from me." David's grip on my arm tightened. "Let's wait until after the tour. I want you to be able to focus on what Dr. Vega is showing us." Of course, I agreed, but I made a mental note that David didn't want me communicating with anyone back home. Probably because missing person reports would complicate his timeline. The resort's valet brought around a black SUV with tinted windows. Not the rental car we'd been using for our tourist activities, but something that looked more official, more medical. David helped me into the passenger seat with exaggerated gentleness, the kind of care you show to someone you're about to betray. As we pulled away from the resort, I noticed David taking a route I didn't recognize. We weren't heading toward the main tourist areas of Cabo, but inland, toward a building. "This isn't a medical facility. This is something else entirely." David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You're being hysterical. These are medical professionals. Dr. Vega is waiting for us." But I could see panic in his eyes now. The scream had been unexpected, and it had drawn attention. A few people had emerged from other buildings in the complex, curious about the commotion. David's private, discreet operation was becoming very public very quickly. "Let go of me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "I don't want to be here. I want to go back to the hotel." One of the men in white coats said something to David in rapid Spanish. I caught enough to understand that they were telling him to get me inside quickly, that they couldn't afford this kind of attention. David's mask finally slipped completely. "Get in the building, Jessica, now." "No," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not going anywhere with you." That's when David made his fatal mistake. In front of witnesses, in broad daylight, he tried to physically force me toward the building. The man I'd married, who'd promised to love and protect me, grabbed me by both arms and started dragging me toward what I now knew was essentially an organ harvesting facility. And that's when the sirens started. At first they were distant, just a faint wailing that could have been anything, but they got louder quickly, closer, and I saw David's face go white with terror. The two men in white coats immediately started backing toward the building, clearly planning to disappear inside and deny any involvement. "Federal agents!" The voice came from a megaphone, amplified and authoritative. "Nobody move!" Black SUVs with government plates came screaming into the parking lot from 3 different directions, cutting off any escape routes. Men and women in FBI windbreakers poured out, weapons drawn, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from careful planning. David's hands fell away from my arms like I'd suddenly caught fire. He looked around wildly, probably trying to calculate if he could run, if he could fight, if he could somehow talk his way out of this. But there was nowhere to go, and nothing to say that would explain why he was trying to force his wife into an unlicensed medical facility. "David Chen," one of the agents called out, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit aggravated assault, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit organ trafficking." I watched my husband of 1 week get handcuffed and read his rights while federal agents secured the medical facility that had been preparing to harvest my kidney. The 2 men in white coats were also arrested, along with several other people who emerged from the building looking panicked and confused. Detective Williams appeared at my side, his familiar face a welcome sight in the chaos. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning me for injuries. "I'm okay," I said, and I realized I meant it. "I'm actually okay." "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "You handled this exactly right." As I watched David being loaded into the back of a federal vehicle, he looked at me through the window with an expression I'd never seen before. Not love, not even anger, but something colder. Calculation, like he was trying to figure out how I'd outsmarted him, how his perfect victim had turned into his worst nightmare. I thought about all the other women who might have gotten into that SUV, who might have trusted their husbands or boyfriends, or partners enough to walk into that building, women who didn't have federal prosecutors for mothers, who didn't know to document everything, who didn't have Detective Williams on speed dial. The realization hit me then, standing in that parking lot surrounded by federal agents and evidence of an international organ trafficking operation. This wasn't just about me. David hadn't chosen me randomly. He'd been hunting for the perfect victim, someone with the right blood type, the right health profile, the right level of trust and isolation. How many other women had he evaluated before settling on me? How many other operations like this were running in places like Cabo, preying on tourists who trusted the wrong people? But as I gave my statement to the federal agents, as I handed over all the evidence I'd collected, as I watched them begin the process of dismantling what was clearly a sophisticated international operation, I felt something my mother had taught me to recognize. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about prevention. It was about making sure the next person who found themselves in my situation would have a better chance of survival. David had made one fundamental error in his victim selection. He'd chosen the daughter of Sofia Martinez, and Sofia Martinez had raised me to be anything but a victim. The federal agents found enough evidence in the Vista Del Mar Medical Center to expose an organ trafficking network that spanned 3 countries and had been operating for over 5 years. They found surgical equipment, harvested organs being prepared for transport, and records of previous procedures that made my stomach turn. Most importantly, they found a list of future targets, other tourists and expats who'd been identified as potential organ donors. As the sun began to set over Cabo San Lucas, I found myself back at the Casa Blanca Resort, giving additional statements to federal agents while David's belongings were searched and cataloged as evidence. The honeymoon suite that had seemed so romantic just days before now felt like a crime scene, which I suppose it was. My phone rang as the agents were finishing up. It was my sister Sarah, calling from Phoenix with worry in her voice. "Jess, I've been trying to reach you all day. Are you okay? I saw something on the news about arrests in Cabo, and I couldn't help thinking about you." I looked around the suite, at the federal agents packing up evidence, at the medical consent forms that had started this whole nightmare, at the blue cocktail glass that had contained enough sedatives to knock out a horse. "I'm okay, Sarah," I said, and for the first time in days I meant it completely. "I'm better than okay. I'm coming home." The extradition hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday in a sterile courthouse in downtown Phoenix that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a charcoal gray suit that my mother would have approved of, watching David shuffle into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his pharmaceutical sales swagger and designer clothes. When his eyes found mine across the courtroom, I didn't look away. David's lawyer, a nervous man with thinning hair and sweaty palms, had been making desperate arguments for bail reduction all week. He painted his client as a loving husband who'd been manipulated by international criminals, a victim of circumstance who'd simply gotten in over his head. The story might have been convincing if the federal prosecutors hadn't presented 17 boxes of evidence that told a very different tale. "Your Honor," David's attorney said, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who knew he was defending the indefensible, "my client has no prior criminal record, strong ties to the community, and poses no flight risk. He's been a respected pharmaceutical sales representative for over 8 years, with an exemplary employment record." I almost laughed at that. Exemplary employment record. If only they knew that David's pharmaceutical connections had been how he'd built his organ trafficking network in the first place, using his legitimate business travel to scout locations and establish relationships with corrupt medical professionals across 3 countries. Federal prosecutor Maria Gonzalez stood to respond, and I felt a familiar surge of pride. Maria had worked with my mother on several high-profile medical crime cases, and she understood the intricacies of organ trafficking better than anyone in the state. She'd been personally overseeing David's case since his arrest in Cabo. "Your Honor," Maria said, her voice calm and authoritative, "the defendant is facing charges in multiple jurisdictions for his role in an international organ trafficking conspiracy that has victimized dozens of people over the past 5 years. The evidence shows systematic planning, international coordination, and a complete disregard for human life. Mr. Chen specifically targeted his own wife for organ harvesting during their honeymoon, demonstrating a level of premeditation and callousness that makes him an extreme danger to the community." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen every kind of criminal defense excuse imaginable, looked unimpressed by David's attorney's arguments. "Mr. Richardson, your client lured his wife to a foreign country with the express purpose of harvesting her organs for sale on the black market. The court finds that no amount of bail would be sufficient to ensure public safety or the defendant's appearance at trial." David's shoulders sagged as the judge denied bail and remanded him to federal custody pending trial. But as the bailiffs approached to escort him back to his holding cell, he turned toward me one more time. Instead of the rage or desperation I expected to see, his expression was almost calculating, like he was trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. I met his gaze steadily, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my expression neutral. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger or vindication. I simply looked at him the way I might look at a stranger on the street, with polite disinterest. Because that's what he was to me now. A stranger who'd happened to share my bed while planning to cut me open. After the hearing, Maria Gonzalez approached me in the courthouse hallway. "How are you holding up, Jessica? I know this can't be easy." "I'm doing better than I expected," I said, and it was true. It helps knowing that the evidence is so solid. David won't be able to hurt anyone else. Maria nodded. "The investigation has expanded significantly since Cabo. We've identified at least 12 other victims across the network, and we're working with international law enforcement to shut down similar operations in Guatemala and Colombia. Your documentation and cooperation made all of this possible. That evening, I sat in my mother's old study in the house I'd grown up in, surrounded by her law, books, and case files. I'd moved back here temporarily after returning from Mexico, partly for security reasons and partly because I needed to be somewhere that felt safe and familiar. The federal agents had assured me that David's associates had all been arrested, but old habits die hard, and my mother had taught me never to take unnecessary risks. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Saw the news coverage of the hearing. How are you feeling? Want company? I smiled and typed back, I'm okay. Really. Come over if you want. I'll order pizza. An hour later, Sarah arrived with a bottle of wine and a concerned expression. She'd been hovering ever since I got back from Cabo, clearly struggling with the revelation that her sister had married a man who'd planned to harvest her organs. You seem remarkably calm about all this, Sarah said as we settled in the living room with our pizza and wine. I mean, the man you married tried to sell your kidney. Aren't you angry? Traumatized? Something? I considered her question carefully. I was angry, I said finally. Furious, actually. But not at David specifically. I was angry at myself for not trusting my instincts sooner. I knew something was wrong with our relationship for months, but I kept talking myself out of it. That's not the same thing as being angry at someone who tried to literally butcher you for profit, Sarah pointed out. I think I used up all my anger in Cabo, I said. When I found those consent forms, when I realized what he was planning, I felt this incredible rage. But then I channeled it into action. I documented everything, called Detective Williams, set up the sting operation. By the time the federal agents arrested David, I just felt empty. Relieved, but empty. Sarah studied me with the expression she'd worn since we were children when she was trying to figure out if I was telling her the truth. Mom always said you were the most pragmatic person she knew. I guess she was right. Mom taught me that emotion without action is just self-indulgence, I said, raising my wine glass in a small toast to the framed photo of our mother on the bookshelf. She would have been proud that I didn't fall apart when it mattered. Over the next few weeks, as David's case moved through the federal system and the media attention intensified, I found myself becoming something I'd never expected, a reluctant expert on organ trafficking and medical crimes. News programs wanted interviews, advocacy groups wanted me to speak at conferences, and law enforcement agencies wanted my input on victim identification and prevention strategies. I turned down most of the media requests, but I did agree to work with the FBI's Victim Services Division to develop training materials for other potential victims. The profile of David's targets was disturbingly specific. Educated women in their late 20s to early 30s, usually working in medical or scientific fields, often with deceased parents or limited family support systems. Women who were intelligent enough to seem like worthwhile targets, but isolated enough to disappear without immediate detection. Detective Williams visited me regularly during this period, partly to coordinate on the federal case, and partly because he felt responsible for my well-being. Your mother made me promise to look out for you if anything ever happened to her, he told me one afternoon as we sat in my mother's garden. I don't think she imagined it would involve international organ trafficking, but a promise is a promise. Ray, I said, looking up from the victim profiles I'd been reviewing, can I ask you something? When you worked with my mother, did you ever see cases where the victims just moved on? Like, didn't fall apart or need years of therapy or become advocates for change? He considered the question seriously. Sometimes, usually the ones who survived because they were prepared, because they had the tools and knowledge to fight back. The ones who felt like they had some control over what happened to them. That's how I feel, I said. Like I wasn't really a victim because I saw it coming and stopped it. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense, Ray said. Your mother was the same way. She always said that knowledge was the best protection, that if you understood the predator's methods, they couldn't truly victimize you. The preliminary hearing for David's federal trial was scheduled for early December, about 6 months after our disastrous honeymoon. I'd been dreading it, not because I was afraid to testify, but because I wasn't sure how I'd react to seeing David again after all this time. Would I feel angry? Sad? Nothing at all? As it turned out, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. David had lost at least 30 pounds in federal custody, and his once confident demeanor had been replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem younger and more desperate. His expensive suit had been replaced by a standard defendant's attire, and his perfectly styled hair had grown out into an unkempt mess. He looked like what he was: a man whose carefully constructed life had collapsed around him. When I took the witness stand to testify about the events in Cabo, David watched me intently, as if he was still trying to figure out how I'd outmaneuvered him. I answered the prosecutor's questions clearly and concisely, walking the jury through the timeline of events from finding the consent forms to the federal raid on the medical facility. "Mrs. Chen," the prosecutor said during my direct examination, "when you discovered the surgical consent forms in your husband's luggage, what was your immediate reaction?" "I was shocked at first," I said, my voice steady, "but then everything made sense. All the things about our relationship that had felt wrong suddenly had an explanation." "Can you elaborate on what felt wrong?" I looked directly at David as I answered. His interest in my medical history seemed excessive. He was always asking about my health, my blood type, whether I took any medications. He encouraged me to avoid alcohol and maintain a specific diet in the weeks before our honeymoon. At the time, I thought he was just being health conscious, but in retrospect, it was clear he was preparing my body for surgery. David's attorney objected to several of my responses, claiming they were speculative, but the judge allowed most of my testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. The consent forms, the recordings I'd made, the financial records showing payments from organ trafficking networks, and the testimony of the federal agents who'd raided the medical facility. During cross-examination, David's attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive wife who'd orchestrated an elaborate frame job because of marital problems. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you were having doubts about your marriage even before the honeymoon?" "I had concerns about certain aspects of my husband's behavior," I admitted. "But I never imagined he was planning to harvest my organs." "And yet you had been secretly recording conversations and documenting his activities for months before the alleged crime took place." "My mother was a federal prosecutor who specialized in medical crimes," I said calmly. "She taught me to document anything that seemed suspicious, especially in relationships. It's a habit that probably saved my life." The attorney pressed on, trying to make it seem like I'd been planning to divorce David and had invented the organ trafficking story to gain leverage. But the physical evidence was too overwhelming, and his arguments fell flat with the jury. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I'd told my story truthfully and completely, and now it was up to the justice system to do its job. David was still watching me as I left the courtroom, but his expression had changed from calculation to something that might have been regret. Outside the courthouse, Maria Gonzalez updated me on the broader investigation. "We've shut down the entire network," she said. 17 arrests across 4 countries, and we've identified 43 victims over the past 7 years. Your case was the key that broke everything open." "What about the other victims?" I asked. "Are they okay?" "Most of them are recovering," Maria said. "We've connected them with victim services and medical care. Several have expressed interest in meeting with you, if you're comfortable with that." I thought about it as I drove home through the desert landscape of Phoenix, past the familiar landmarks of my childhood. Meeting other victims might help them feel less alone, less damaged by what had happened to them. And it might help me understand my own reaction to David's betrayal, which still felt strangely detached compared to what I thought I should be feeling. That night, I called Detective Williams. "Ray, I've been thinking about something. Do you think it's normal that I'm not more upset about all this? I mean, the man I married tried to kill me for money, and I feel like I'm processing it the same way I'd process a work problem." "Jess," Ray said gently, "there's no normal way to react to something like this. Your mother always said that the strongest survivors were the ones who could compartmentalize trauma and focus on solutions rather than emotions. It doesn't mean you're not affected. It means you're coping in a healthy way. But shouldn't I be crying or having nightmares or something? Shouldn't I be afraid to trust people again?" "Maybe you will be later," Ray said. "Or maybe this is how you process things. Your mother was the same way. She could walk through the most horrific crime scenes and maintain perfect composure because she understood that falling apart wouldn't help the victims. You're wired the same way." After we hung up, I sat in my mother's study and thought about the choices I'd made since returning from Cabo. I'd moved back into my childhood home, taken a leave of absence from my job, and thrown myself into helping with the federal investigation. I'd been methodical about protecting myself, careful about who I trusted, but I hadn't shut down emotionally or become paranoid about relationships in general. Maybe Ray was right. Maybe this was just how I processed trauma. By taking action, by helping other people, by making sure the predator couldn't hurt anyone else. Maybe the composure that everyone found so surprising was actually my way of honoring my mother's memory and the lessons she'd taught me about turning victimization into empowerment. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi Jessica, this is Maria Santos. I was one of the victims in the organ trafficking case. The prosecutor gave me your number and said you might be willing to talk. I'm struggling with some things and could use advice from someone who understands." I stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about what my mother would have done. Then I typed back, "Of course, call me anytime. We survivors need to stick together." As I sent the message, I realized something that surprised me. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Not because David was going to prison, not because the trafficking network had been dismantled, but because I was going to use what had happened to me to help other people survive what had happened to them. My mother had always said that the best revenge against predators was to make sure their actions ultimately served justice. David had chosen me as a victim because he thought I was vulnerable and isolated. Instead, he'd chosen the one person who had the knowledge, connections, and determination to bring down his entire operation. In trying to destroy me, he'd destroyed himself. And in the process, he'd given me a purpose I never would have found otherwise. There was a kind of poetic justice in that, the kind my mother would have appreciated. David Chen had gambled everything on his ability to manipulate and victimize me. He'd lost that gamble completely, and now he was going to spend the next 20 years in federal prison thinking about his miscalculation. Meanwhile, I was going to spend the next 20 years making sure that other potential victims had the tools and knowledge to protect themselves. When I thought about it that way, I almost felt grateful to David. Almost. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 8 months after David's sentencing. I was sitting in my new office at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons, reviewing case files for potential organ trafficking victims, when my assistant knocked on the door with a concerned expression. "Jessica, there's a letter here addressed to you personally. It's from the Federal Correctional Facility in Tucson. Should I screen it first?" I looked up from the stack of missing person reports I'd been analyzing. Since joining the center 6 months ago, I'd been working to identify patterns and disappearances that might indicate organ trafficking operations. It was demanding work, but it felt like the most meaningful thing I'd ever done with my life. "No, it's okay," I said, accepting the envelope. "I'll handle it." The letter was from David. I recognized his handwriting immediately, though it looked shakier than I remembered. Prison had clearly taken its toll on the man who'd once radiated pharmaceutical sales confidence. I considered throwing the letter away without reading it, but my mother had always taught me that information was power, even when it came from questionable sources. "Dear Jessica," the letter began, and I could almost hear his voice in the carefully chosen words. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I want you to know that I realize now how wrong I was. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong in a way that I couldn't see at the time." I set the letter down and walked to my office window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. David's words felt hollow, like something his prison counselor had coached him to write as part of a rehabilitation program. But I kept reading anyway. "I want to tell you something that might help with your work at the center. The operation you helped shut down was bigger than even the federal prosecutors realized. There were feeder networks in at least 6 other countries, and some of the victims were never reported missing because they were undocumented immigrants or runaways. I kept detailed records of everything, and I've been working with the FBI to identify additional victims." That got my attention. I sat back down and read more carefully. "I know this doesn't make up for what I tried to do to you, but I've given the authorities information about 127 additional victims across the network. Some of them can still be helped. I thought you should know that your courage in Cabo saved more lives than you probably realized." The letter continued for another page, with David expressing remorse and asking for my forgiveness. But it was the postscript that really caught my eye. P.S. You should know that you were never random. We'd been tracking you for over 2 years before I approached you at that pharmaceutical conference. Your mother's work on medical crimes made you a high-value target because we thought law enforcement would never suspect someone from that background. We were obviously very wrong about that. I read the postscript 3 times, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. David hadn't just happened to meet me at a conference and decided I'd make a good victim. I'd been specifically targeted because of my mother's work, chosen because they thought my background would make me overconfident and therefore easier to manipulate. The irony was staggering. They'd selected me precisely because of the tools my mother had given me to protect myself, thinking those tools would make me complacent. Instead, those same tools had allowed me to recognize the threat and neutralize it. My mother's legacy had protected me in ways I'd never fully understood. I called Detective Williams immediately. "Ray, I just got a letter from David. He says they'd been tracking me for 2 years before we met. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a targeted operation." "That changes things," Ray said grimly. "If they were targeting you specifically, there might be other people in similar situations who don't know they're being hunted. Can you forward me a copy of that letter?" "Already scanned and sent," I said. "But Ray, there's something else. David claims there are 127 additional victims that the original investigation missed. People who were never reported missing." Jesus. "Okay, I'll contact Maria Gonzalez and get this information to the federal task force. This could open up dozens of new cases." After hanging up with Ray, I sat in my office and thought about what this revelation meant. For 8 months, I'd been telling myself that David's attempt to harvest my organs was essentially random bad luck, like being struck by lightning or getting food poisoning. Learning that I'd been specifically targeted for 2 years changed everything. It meant that every interaction we'd had during our courtship had been calculated. Every romantic gesture, every sweet text message, every moment of apparent intimacy had been part of an elaborate hunting strategy. David had studied me the way a scientist studies a lab rat, learning my weaknesses and vulnerabilities so he could exploit them more effectively. But instead of making me feel more violated, this knowledge actually made me feel more empowered. Because it meant that my survival hadn't been luck either. David and his associates had done everything right according to their methodology. They'd identified the perfect victim, spent 2 years building the perfect trap, and executed their plan with professional precision. And I'd still beaten them. I thought about all the other potential victims who might be in similar situations right now, being courted by charming partners who saw them as walking organ donors rather than human beings. How many women were having romantic dinners with men who were mentally calculating the street value of their kidneys? How many honeymooners were being led to medical facilities that weren't what they seemed? That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting with my team at the center. We'd been working on developing an early warning system for organ trafficking, but David's letter suggested we needed to think bigger and more systematically. "We need to create a database of high-risk individuals," I told my colleagues as we gathered in the conference room. "People whose backgrounds, professions, or family situations make them attractive targets for organ traffickers. Then we need to figure out how to warn them without causing mass panic." Dr. Amanda Foster, our lead researcher, raised an eyebrow. "That's a huge undertaking, Jessica. We're talking about potentially thousands of people across multiple risk categories." "The organ trafficking network I helped expose had been operating for over 7 years," I said. "They had sophisticated target identification and surveillance capabilities. If we can reverse engineer their methodology, we can identify people who might be at risk before they become victims." Over the next several weeks, we dove deep into the case files from David's network and similar operations. What we found was both fascinating and terrifying. Organ traffickers had developed remarkably sophisticated victim selection criteria that went far beyond simple medical compatibility. They looked for people with specific psychological profiles, high achievers who were used to controlling their own destinies, people who'd experienced significant losses that might make them more susceptible to emotional manipulation, individuals with careers that required frequent travel or irregular schedules that would make their disappearance less immediately noticeable. They also targeted people with valuable skill sets that could be exploited during the grooming process. Medical professionals, researchers, people in pharmaceutical or biotechnology fields, anyone whose knowledge could be useful to the operation while they were being prepared for harvest. Most chillingly, they specifically sought out people with deceased parents or limited family support systems, calculating that these individuals would be less likely to have someone notice if their behavior changed or if they disappeared entirely. I realized that I'd checked almost every box on their target list. Deceased mother who'd been a federal prosecutor, career in medical research, limited family support, recent emotional trauma from my mother's death, regular travel for conferences. I had been the perfect victim from their perspective, which made my survival even more remarkable. Armed with this understanding, we began developing what we called the Guardian Protocol, a system for identifying and discreetly protecting high-risk individuals before they could be targeted by organ trafficking networks. The first phase involved creating risk assessment algorithms that could flag potential targets based on publicly available information. Social media profiles, professional databases, conference attendance records, and other open sources could reveal people who fit the traffickers' preferred victim profiles. The second phase involved developing warning systems that could alert at-risk individuals without revealing specific intelligence about ongoing investigations. We created educational materials about medical tourism scams, romance fraud, and other tactics used by organ traffickers, then distributed them through professional organizations and social media platforms. The third phase was the most ambitious, creating a network of trained volunteers who could provide support and verification services for people who suspected they might be targets. Former victims, law enforcement professionals, medical experts, and other specialists who could help potential victims evaluate their situations and take protective action. 6 months after receiving David's letter, we launched the Guardian Protocol as a pilot program in 3 major metropolitan areas. The response was overwhelming. Within the first week, we received over 200 inquiries from people who were concerned about partners, family members, or their own situations. Most of the inquiries turned out to be false alarms, people who'd been influenced by media coverage or who were dealing with normal relationship issues. But we identified 17 cases that showed genuine red flags, and in 3 of those cases we were able to prevent what appeared to be active organ trafficking operations. The most dramatic success came in Dallas, where a woman named Patricia Williams contacted us about her new boyfriend's suspicious behavior. He'd been pressuring her to travel with him to Costa Rica for what he claimed was a romantic getaway, but something about his insistence on specific medical preparations made her nervous. Our team was able to verify that Patricia's boyfriend had connections to a known organ trafficking network, and that the Costa Rica facility he'd chosen had been flagged by international law enforcement as a suspected harvesting site. We coordinated with the FBI to arrest him before Patricia could be taken out of the country. "You saved my life," Patricia told me during a phone call after her boyfriend's arrest. "I knew something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Having someone validate my instincts made all the difference." Those words meant more to me than any professional recognition or media attention. Because that's what my mother had taught me: to trust my instincts, to document everything, and to seek help when something felt wrong. The Guardian Protocol was essentially a way of giving other people access to the same protective tools my mother had given me. As the program expanded nationally and then internationally, I found myself becoming something I'd never expected: a leading expert on organ trafficking prevention. I testified before Congress about the scope of the problem, consulted with international law enforcement agencies, and spoke at conferences around the world about victim protection strategies. But the work that mattered most to me was the individual cases. Every potential victim we identified and protected, every trafficking operation we helped dismantle, every person who called our hotline and received the validation they needed to trust their instincts. 2 years after David's conviction, I received a package at my office with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a successful organ transplant that had saved a child's life, performed using a kidney that had been donated through legitimate medical channels. There was no note, but I recognized the handwriting on the envelope as belonging to one of the trafficking victims we'd helped identify and rescue. The message was clear: Because we'd stopped her from being harvested illegally, she'd been able to choose to donate an organ legally to someone who needed it. Her kidney had saved a life anyway, but on her terms, and through proper medical procedures. I kept that newspaper clipping on my desk as a reminder of why the work mattered. Organ trafficking wasn't just about the victims who were harmed. It was about all the legitimate medical procedures that were tainted by association, all the people who needed transplants but couldn't get them because of black market operations, all the families who lost loved ones to preventable crimes. David was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and would be eligible for parole in 17 years. Sometimes I wondered if he truly understood the scope of what he'd been part of, or if he still saw it as just a business that had gone wrong. His letters became less frequent over time, and eventually stopped entirely. I never wrote back to him, not because I was angry, but because I had nothing to say to him that wouldn't be better said through my work. Every trafficking operation we disrupted, every victim we protected, every person we trained to recognize the warning signs, that was my response to what David had tried to do to me. The last time I thought about David was on the 3rd anniversary of our disastrous honeymoon. I was in Cabo San Lucas again, but this time as part of a delegation working with Mexican authorities to strengthen their organ trafficking prevention programs. We were staying at a different resort, but I drove past Casa Blanca on the way to our meetings. The resort looked smaller than I remembered, less impressive somehow. The honeymoon suite where I'd found the surgical consent forms was probably occupied by an actual honeymoon couple, people who were genuinely in love and looking forward to building a life together. I hoped they were happy, I hoped they were safe, and I hoped that if they ever found themselves in a situation like mine, they'd have the tools and knowledge they needed to protect themselves. Standing on that beach in Cabo, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I realized that David had given me something he never intended, a purpose that was bigger than anything I could have imagined for myself. In trying to destroy me, he'd led me to the most meaningful work of my life. My mother had always said that the best revenge was living well and helping others do the same. 3 years later, surrounded by colleagues who shared my mission and knowing that our work was saving lives around the world, I understood what she meant. David Chen had gambled his life on his ability to victimize me. Instead, he'd created his own worst nightmare, a victim who refused to stay silent, who turned her survival into a weapon against people like him, and who dedicated her life to making sure his methods would never work again. In the end, that seemed like justice enough. 5 years had passed since that February morning when I first received David's letter from federal prison, and the world had changed in ways I never could have anticipated. The Guardian Protocol had evolved from a small pilot program into an international network spanning 43 countries, with over 12,000 trained volunteers and a sophisticated early warning system that had prevented more than 800 confirmed organ trafficking attempts. I was standing in the main conference room of our new headquarters in Geneva, looking out at delegates from 15 countries who had gathered for the 5th International Conference on Organ Trafficking Prevention. The room buzzed with the energy of people who shared a common mission, professionals who understood that every day of delay meant more innocent people would disappear into the medical black market. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had become my closest collaborator over the years, was presenting the latest statistics from our global database. In the past 12 months alone, we've identified and neutralized 17 active trafficking networks across 4 continents. The economic impact of these disruptions is estimated at over $400 million in prevented illegal organ sales. The numbers were impressive, but they told only part of the story. Behind each statistic was a human being who'd been saved from experiencing what I'd narrowly escaped in Cabo San Lucas. Each prevented trafficking attempt represented a family that wouldn't have to wonder what happened to their loved one, a person who wouldn't wake up in a bathtub full of ice missing vital organs. During the lunch break, I walked through the corridors of the United Nations building, past the flags of member nations and the portraits of diplomats who dedicated their lives to international cooperation. It felt surreal to think that my work had grown from a personal survival story into something that influenced global policy and international law. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Thompson, who'd become not just my lawyer but one of my closest friends over the years. Saw the BBC coverage of the conference. Your mother would be incredibly proud of what you've built. Coffee? When you get back to Phoenix?" I smiled, typing back a quick response as I headed back to the conference room. Marcus had been there through every major milestone of the past 5 years, from the first successful Guardian Protocol intervention to my testimony before the International Criminal Court about the need for stronger organ trafficking penalties. The afternoon session focused on new technologies for victim identification and protection. We'd developed an AI system that could analyze social media patterns, travel records, and communication data to identify potential trafficking targets before they were approached by predators. The system had been controversial initially, with privacy advocates raising concerns about surveillance overreach, but the results spoke for themselves. "The technology doesn't identify specific individuals," I explained to the assembly. "Instead, it creates risk heat maps that allow law enforcement to focus their prevention efforts in areas where trafficking activity is most likely to occur. It's the difference between following someone and knowing where to look for patterns of predatory behavior." Dr. Sarah Kimanani from the Kenyan delegation raised her hand. "Ms. Martinez, can you tell us about the psychological profiling component? How do you distinguish between legitimate romantic relationships and trafficking recruitment?" It was a question I'd answered hundreds of times over the years, but it never got easier. "Trafficking recruitment often follows predictable patterns," I said. "Accelerated intimacy, isolation from family and friends, unusual interest in medical history and physical health, pressure to travel to specific locations, and control over diet and lifestyle choices. The key is education, teaching people to recognize these red flags before they become victims." After the session ended, I found myself alone in the conference room, staring at the presentation slides that summarized 5 years of work. The graphs and charts were impressive, but they couldn't capture the emotional journey that had brought me to this point. In the early days after David's arrest, I'd struggled with feelings of isolation and alienation that had nothing to do with physical safety. Friends and family members didn't know how to relate to someone who'd survived such an unusual form of betrayal. How do you comfort someone whose husband tried to sell their organs? How do you offer advice about trust and relationships to someone who'd been so thoroughly deceived? The isolation had been particularly acute during the first year after David's sentencing. Well-meaning people would ask if I was dating again, if I was ready to move on and find love with someone new. The questions always made me feel like I was expected to treat David's betrayal as just another bad breakup rather than a systematic attempt to murder me for profit. But the isolation had also been productive in unexpected ways. Without the distraction of romantic relationships, or the pressure to appear normal, I'd been able to focus entirely on understanding the mechanics of organ trafficking and developing systems to prevent it. The emotional distance that worried my friends had actually been an asset in my professional work. Dr. Rodriguez joined me in the empty conference room, settling into the chair next to mine, with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become family over the years. "You look contemplative," she said. "Thinking about the early days?" "Something like that," I said. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if David had succeeded? If I'd never found those consent forms, or if Detective Williams hadn't been able to mobilize federal agents in time?" Elena considered the question seriously. She'd heard variations of it from me over the years, usually during quiet moments after particularly successful interventions. "I think about it every time we save someone," she said. "Every person we protect is living the life you would have lost. In a strange way, your survival multiplied exponentially through all the people we've been able to help." That evening, I had dinner alone at a small restaurant near the UN building, watching tourists and diplomats enjoy their meals while I reviewed case files on my tablet. It was a habit I'd developed over the years, using downtime to stay current on emerging trafficking patterns and new victim profiles. The latest reports were troubling. Trafficking networks had adapted to our prevention efforts by becoming more sophisticated in their recruitment methods. Instead of targeting individuals randomly, they were now conducting extensive background research and using psychological manipulation techniques that were harder to detect. They'd also begun recruiting accomplices from within legitimate medical institutions, using doctors and nurses who had access to patient records and surgical facilities. The corruption was spreading through the healthcare system like a virus, making it harder to distinguish between legitimate medical professionals and predators. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the files. It was Detective Williams calling from Phoenix with news about a case we'd been tracking for several months. Jessica, we just arrested the last member of the Los Angeles network. Dr. Patricia Valdez was picked up at LAX trying to board a flight to Brazil with surgical equipment and patient records for 12 potential victims. I set down my fork, giving Ray my full attention. Were we able to identify all 12 targets? 10 of them, yes. We've made contact and provided protective services. The other 2 had already left the country for what they thought were romantic getaways. We're working with international partners to locate them. Any connection to David's original network? That's the interesting part, Ray said. Dr. Valdez had been in communication with David through a prison correspondence program. He'd been providing advice and guidance about victim selection and recruitment strategies, even from federal custody. I felt a familiar chill, the same sensation I'd experienced when reading David's letter about being specifically targeted. Even in prison, David was still trying to perfect his methods, still looking for ways to optimize the process of turning human beings into commodity organs. Ray, I think we need to recommend that David be placed in solitary confinement with no outside communication privileges. He's essentially running a consulting service for organ traffickers from his prison cell. Already in the works, Ray said. The warden is reviewing his correspondence privileges, and the federal prosecutor is considering additional charges related to conspiracy and continuing criminal enterprise. After hanging up, I sat in the restaurant feeling a complex mix of emotions that I'd become familiar with over the years. There was satisfaction in knowing that another trafficking network had been dismantled, relief that potential victims had been protected, but also a deep weariness at the realization that the fight would never truly be over. Every network we shut down was replaced by 2 more. Every prevention strategy we developed was eventually countered by new recruitment techniques. The traffickers were learning and adapting just as quickly as we were, creating an endless cycle of action and reaction that sometimes felt futile. But then I thought about Patricia Williams in Dallas, whose life we'd saved during one of our first interventions. She'd gone on to become a Guardian Protocol volunteer herself, helping to identify and protect other potential victims. Her survival had created a ripple effect of protection that extended far beyond her individual case. The next morning, I flew back to Phoenix with a renewed sense of purpose. The isolation that had defined my life for the past 5 years wasn't a burden. It was a resource that allowed me to focus entirely on the mission without the distractions and compromises that came with trying to maintain normal relationships. During the flight, I reviewed applications for the Guardian Protocol's latest expansion into South America. The trafficking networks were becoming increasingly international, moving victims across borders to avoid detection and prosecution. Our response needed to be equally global and coordinated. Sarah met me at the airport in Phoenix, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern that I'd learned to recognize over the years. "Welcome back," she said as we walked toward baggage claim. "How was Geneva?" "Productive," I said. "We got approval for the South American expansion, and the EU is committed to funding our technology development for another 3 years. How are things here?" "Busy. We've had 17 new inquiries through the hotline this week, and 3 of them look like active cases. Also, there's something I need to tell you about David." I stopped walking. "What about David?" "He's been trying to contact you directly. The prison administration forwarded a formal request for a visit. He claims he has information about trafficking networks that could save lives, but he'll only share it with you personally." The request shouldn't have surprised me. David had always been manipulative, and 5 years in federal prison would have given him plenty of time to develop new strategies for getting what he wanted. But the timing was suspicious, coming just days after we'd arrested Dr. Valdez and discovered his consulting arrangement with other traffickers. "What kind of information?" I asked as we resumed walking. "He claims to know about a network that's targeting military families, using veterans' medical records and deployment schedules to identify potential victims. If it's true, it could be huge. Military personnel move frequently, have irregular schedules, and often have limited family support systems during deployments. I thought about it as we drove through the familiar streets of Phoenix toward my office. Military families would indeed be attractive targets for organ traffickers, and their unique vulnerabilities would require specialized prevention strategies. But accepting a meeting with David would be emotionally complicated in ways I wasn't sure I was prepared to handle. Over the next few days, I consulted with Ray, Marcus, and my team at the Guardian Protocol about David's request. The consensus was that the potential intelligence value outweighed the personal risks, but everyone agreed that the meeting should be carefully controlled and monitored. "If you decide to do this," Marcus said during one of our planning sessions, "I want federal agents present, recording equipment, and a clear protocol for ending the meeting if David tries any psychological manipulation." Dr. Rodriguez was more direct. "Jessica, you've built something incredible over the past 5 years. Don't let him derail your work with mind games. Whatever information he has, there are other ways to obtain it." But I knew I was going to accept the meeting. Not because I believed David had suddenly developed a conscience, but because I needed to understand what he was really trying to accomplish. If he was still actively consulting for trafficking networks from prison, I needed to know the scope of his influence and find ways to neutralize it. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the visitor's room of the Federal Correctional Facility in Tucson, waiting for David to be brought in. The room was sterile and monitored, with cameras recording every word and gesture. Federal agents were stationed outside, and Marcus sat beside me with legal documents that would immediately terminate the meeting if David violated any of the agreed-upon conditions. When David walked into the room, I barely recognized him. 5 years in federal prison had transformed the confident pharmaceutical sales representative into a gaunt, gray-haired man who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to navigate a dangerous environment. But his eyes were the same, calculating, predatory, always looking for angles and opportunities. "Hello, Jessica," he said as he sat down across from me. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I'm here for the information you claim to have," I said directly. "Nothing else," David smiled, the same charming expression that had once made my heart race and now made my stomach turn. "Always straight to business. I always admired that about you. It's one of the reasons you were so perfect for our purposes." Marcus leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, you're here to provide information about ongoing criminal activity. Either do that or this meeting is over." "Of course," David said, but he kept his eyes on me. "The military family network is real, Jessica. They've been operating for about 18 months, using a combination of veterans' medical databases and social media surveillance to identify targets. The operation is based in Virginia, with satellite locations in North Carolina and Georgia." He provided specific details about the network's leadership, funding sources, and operational methods. The information was detailed and credible. Exactly the kind of intelligence that could lead to arrests and prevention of multiple trafficking attempts. But I could see that David was enjoying the power dynamic, the fact that he had something we needed, and could control the flow of information. He was still trying to manipulate the situation, even from a federal prison cell. "There's more," David continued. "But I have a condition." "No conditions," Marcus said immediately. "You provide the information or you don't." David ignored him, focusing entirely on me. "I want you to understand something, Jessica. What happened between us, what I tried to do, it wasn't personal. You were a perfect target, but it was never about you specifically. It was just business." The statement was clearly designed to provoke a reaction, to make me angry or upset or somehow validate David's importance in my life. But instead, I felt something I hadn't expected. "Pity, David," I said calmly. "The fact that you see human beings as business opportunities is exactly why you're in prison and why I'm running an international organization that prevents people like you from hurting others. Your inability to understand the difference between people and products is your weakness, not your strength." For the first time since walking into the room, David looked genuinely surprised. He'd expected me to be angry or traumatized or somehow diminished by our encounter. Instead, I was completely unmoved by his attempts at psychological manipulation. "I've spent 5 years turning your failure into other people's survival," I continued. "Every trafficking network we've shut down, every victim we've protected, every person we've trained to recognize the warning signs, That's all because you chose the wrong target. You tried to victimize someone who had the knowledge and connections to fight back. And that miscalculation has cost your entire industry hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of potential victims. David's composure finally cracked. For just a moment, I saw genuine anger flash across his features. The fury of a predator who'd been outmaneuvered by his intended prey. "The military network information," I said. "Give it to us now, or we'll find them ourselves." "We don't actually need you for anything, David. You're just a shortcut to information we'll discover eventually anyway." He provided the rest of the intelligence, probably realizing that his psychological games were ineffective and that cooperation was his only remaining source of power in the situation. The information was valuable. Names, locations, operational schedules, financial records, everything we needed to coordinate with military law enforcement and protect potential victims. As we prepared to leave, David made one final attempt at manipulation. "You know, Jessica, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if things had been different. If we'd met under other circumstances, if I'd been a different person. Do you ever think about that?" I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd spent 2 years studying me, courting me, planning to murder me for profit. "No, David. I don't think about alternative versions of you because the person you are is the only version that matters. You're a predator who sees other human beings as resources to be exploited. That's not something that changes with different circumstances. That's who you fundamentally are." The drive back to Phoenix was quiet. Marcus handled phone calls to federal law enforcement about the military network intelligence, while I stared out the window at the desert landscape, processing the emotional complexity of seeing David again after 5 years. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked after finishing his calls. "Relieved," I said, and realized I meant it. I was worried that seeing him again would bring back old emotions or trauma. Instead, it just confirmed that I made the right choices. David is exactly who I thought he was. A manipulative predator who will never change. But I've changed. I've become someone he can't touch, or influence, or harm. 3 months later, the military family trafficking network was dismantled in a coordinated operation involving federal agents, military police, and Guardian Protocol volunteers. 17 potential victims were identified and protected, and the network's leadership was arrested and charged with federal crimes. The operation was featured on the front page of major newspapers around the world, highlighting both the growing sophistication of organ trafficking networks and the international cooperation required to combat them. But for me, the real victory was more personal. David's attempt to manipulate our prison meeting had backfired completely. Instead of regaining some measure of psychological control over me, he'd demonstrated his own irrelevance to the work I was doing. The Guardian Protocol had evolved beyond his comprehension, becoming something larger and more effective than he could have imagined when he'd first targeted me in Cabo San Lucas. That evening, I sat in my mother's old study, surrounded by case files and reports from around the world. The isolation that had defined my life for 5 years no longer felt like a burden or a consequence of David's betrayal. It felt like a choice I'd made in service of something larger than myself. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Rodriguez. "Saw the news coverage of the military network takedown. Another successful intervention thanks to your leadership. The ripple effects of survival continue to spread." I smiled, thinking about all the people around the world who were safe tonight because of decisions I'd made 5 years ago in a hotel room in Cabo San Lucas. David had tried to turn me into a victim, but instead he'd created something he'd never intended. A survivor whose refusal to be broken had become a weapon against people like him. The isolation before triumph had been necessary, giving me the space and focus needed to build something meaningful from the wreckage of David's betrayal. But the triumph itself wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my survival had multiplied exponentially through all the lives we'd been able to protect. As I turned off the lights in my mother's study and headed upstairs to bed, I realized that David's greatest failure wasn't trying to harvest my organs. It was fundamentally misunderstanding who he was dealing with. He'd seen a vulnerable woman who could be manipulated and exploited, but he'd actually chosen the daughter of Sofia Martinez, someone who'd been trained from childhood to recognize predators and fight back against them. The irony was perfect, and I knew my mother would have appreciated it. David Chen had spent 2 years hunting the perfect victim, and instead he'd found his perfect nightmare. Someone who would not only survive his attack but dedicate her life to making sure he and people like him could never succeed again. In the end, that seemed like the most fitting conclusion to our story. David was serving 25 years in federal prison for his crimes, while I was traveling the world preventing others from experiencing what I'd survived. His attempt to destroy me had instead given me a purpose that was larger and more meaningful than anything I could have imagined for myself. 10 years had passed since that fateful honeymoon in Cabo San Lucas, and I was standing in the very same resort lobby where David had once checked us in as newlyweds with murderous intentions. But this time, I wasn't a target or a victim. I was here as the keynote speaker for the International Summit on Medical Tourism Safety, addressing an audience of resort owners, medical professionals, and law enforcement officials from across Latin America. The Casa Blanca Resort had been completely renovated since my last visit. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the staff moved with the polished efficiency of a luxury establishment that had learned to take security seriously. What they didn't advertise in their brochures was that their transformation had been sparked by the international incident that occurred in their honeymoon suite a decade ago. Ms. Martinez, the resort manager, approached me with the nervous energy of someone who knew exactly who I was and why my presence here was both important and uncomfortable. "We're honored to have you speaking at the summit. I want you to know that we've implemented every security protocol recommended by the Guardian Protocol Organization." I smiled politely, though the irony wasn't lost on me. The same resort that had unknowingly provided David with the perfect cover for his organ harvesting operation was now a model for medical tourism safety. Sometimes the best prevention came from learning from past failures. "I appreciate that," I said. "Prevention is always better than prosecution." As I walked through the resort corridors toward the conference center, I passed the hallway that led to what used to be our honeymoon suite. The memories felt distant now, like scenes from a movie I'd watched years ago, rather than events I'd lived through. The terror, the betrayal, the desperate phone calls to Detective Williams. It all seemed to belong to a different person, a younger version of myself who hadn't yet understood her own strength. The summit's opening ceremony was held in the same ballroom where David and I had attended a welcome reception for honeymoon couples. Back then, I'd been charmed by his attentiveness, the way he'd introduced me to other guests as his brilliant wife, and spoke proudly about my work in medical research. Now I understood that every introduction had been calculated, every conversation an opportunity to gather information about potential future targets. Dr. Elena Rodriguez joined me at the speaker's table, carrying the thick briefing folder that had become our trademark at international conferences. Over the years, she'd become more than a colleague. She was the sister I'd chosen, the person who understood both the mission and the personal cost of the work we did. "How does it feel to be back here?" she asked as we reviewed our presentation materials. "Surreal," I admitted, "but also necessary. If we can't face the places where these crimes happen, how can we expect victims to trust us to protect them?" The audience for my keynote speech was larger than I'd expected, nearly 400 people representing every aspect of the medical tourism industry. Resort managers sat next to federal prosecutors, medical device manufacturers listened alongside victim advocates, and international law enforcement officials shared tables with reformed criminals, who now work to expose trafficking networks. As I approached the podium, I noticed several people in the audience who'd been part of my journey over the past decade. Marcus Thompson had flown in from Phoenix, still serving as my legal counsel and closest advisor. Detective Williams was there representing the FBI's International Human Trafficking Task Force. Even Dr. Patricia Valdez, the surgeon we'd arrested in Los Angeles, was present as part of a prisoner rehabilitation program that allowed convicted traffickers to speak about their crimes to prevention audiences. But the person who commanded my attention was sitting in the back row, partially hidden behind a pillar. David Chen looked older than his 52 years, his hair completely gray and his face marked by the kind of deep lines that come from a decade of federal incarceration. He was wearing civilian clothes rather than a prison uniform, which meant he was either on a supervised release program or had somehow secured temporary permission to attend the conference. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. David's expression was unreadable, but I could see him studying me the same way he used to during our marriage, calculating, analyzing, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. The difference was that now I understood what that look meant, and it no longer had any power over me. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 10 years ago, I was a victim of organ trafficking in this very resort. Today I'm here to talk about how that experience became the foundation for a global prevention network that has saved over 2,000 lives. I told my story chronologically, starting with the discovery of the surgical consent forms in David's luggage, and continuing through the federal investigation, the Guardian Protocol's development, and our recent successes in dismantling trafficking networks around the world. But this time, I included details I'd never shared publicly before: the psychological manipulation tactics David had used, the 2-year grooming process that preceded our marriage, and the sophisticated victim selection criteria that organ traffickers use to identify targets. "The man who tried to harvest my organs didn't choose me randomly," I explained to the rapt audience. "I was specifically selected after an 18-month surveillance and evaluation process. My background in medical research, my deceased mother who'd been a federal prosecutor, my travel schedule, my limited family support system. Every aspect of my life had been analyzed and deemed advantageous for their purposes." I noticed David shifting uncomfortably in his seat as I described his methodology in clinical detail. He'd probably never expected his victim to become an expert on his own criminal techniques, to turn his predatory strategies into educational tools that would protect other people. What my would-be killer didn't understand, I continued, was that the same background that made me an attractive target also gave me the tools to recognize and neutralize the threat. My mother had trained me to document suspicious behavior, to trust my instincts, and to seek help from law enforcement when something felt wrong. Those skills, which were supposed to make me overconfident and therefore easier to manipulate, actually saved my life. The irony had never been lost on me. David and his associates had spent months studying my psychological profile, concluding that my professional confidence and family law enforcement background would make me less likely to suspect a romantic partner of criminal intent. They'd been spectacularly wrong about that calculation. "The organ trafficking industry relies on several key assumptions," I said, clicking to the next slide in my presentation. "First, that victims will be too trusting to recognize grooming behavior. Second, that they'll be too isolated to seek help effectively. Third, that they'll be too ashamed or traumatized to pursue justice after an attack. And fourth, that even if they do survive and report the crime, the system will be too slow and bureaucratic to respond effectively." Each assumption had proven false in my case, and the Guardian Protocol had been designed to make sure they would fail for other potential victims as well. We'd created educational programs that taught people to recognize grooming behavior, support networks that eliminated isolation, counseling services that addressed shame and trauma, and rapid response systems that could coordinate international law enforcement within hours of a reported threat. But perhaps the most important lesson, I said, approaching the conclusion of my speech, is that survival isn't just about escaping immediate danger. True survival means using your experience to prevent others from facing the same threat. It means turning your victimization into someone else's protection. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but I barely heard it. My attention was focused on David, who was now standing at the back of the ballroom, with what appeared to be 2 federal marshals flanking him. He wasn't supposed to be here as a free man. His presence at the conference was clearly part of some kind of supervised program. After the formal presentation ended, I was surrounded by audience members who wanted to share their own experiences or ask questions about implementing Guardian Protocol procedures in their organizations. But I kept one eye on David's location, watching as he moved slowly through the crowd toward the front of the ballroom. Dr. Rodriguez noticed my distraction. "He's here as part of a federal rehabilitation program," she said quietly. "Detective Williams told me about it earlier. David volunteered to participate in a study about criminal psychology and victim impact. Apparently, he's been trying to understand why his methodology failed so completely." "Methodology?" I repeated with a bitter laugh. "He still thinks of it as a technical problem rather than a moral one." "The marshals won't let him approach you directly," Elena assured me. But if you want to speak with him, it can be arranged under controlled circumstances. I considered the offer as I continued answering questions from conference attendees. Part of me was curious about what David might say after 10 years of incarceration and whatever psychological counseling the federal prison system provided. But a larger part of me recognized that any conversation with him would be an attempt on his part to regain some measure of influence or control over the narrative of our shared experience. "No," I said finally. "There's nothing he could say that would change anything and nothing I need to hear from him. He made his choices and I made mine. The results speak for themselves." As the conference crowd began to disperse, I noticed that David had been escorted out of the ballroom by his federal handlers. I felt a strange sense of relief, not because I'd been afraid of confronting him, but because his presence had been a distraction from the real purpose of the summit. That evening, the conference organizers hosted a dinner for international delegates on the resort's terrace overlooking the ocean. The same view that had seemed so romantic during my honeymoon now served as the backdrop for serious discussions about cross-border law enforcement cooperation and victim protection strategies. Marcus joined me at a quiet table near the edge of the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of wine and a concerned expression that I'd learned to recognize over the years. "How are you processing David's appearance today? I know that couldn't have been easy." "It was actually easier than I expected," I said honestly. "Seeing him reminded me of how much I've changed over the past decade. The person he tried to manipulate and kill doesn't exist anymore. I've become someone he couldn't have imagined when he was planning his attack." "Your mother would be proud of who you've become," Marcus said. "She always believed that the best way to honor victims was to make sure their experiences prevented future crimes." I thought about my mother often during conferences like this one. Sofia Martinez had dedicated her career to prosecuting medical crimes, but she'd never imagined that her daughter would need those lessons for personal survival. The irony was that her death in a car accident 5 years before my marriage to David had been one of the factors that made me an attractive target for organ traffickers. My grief and isolation had been weaponized against me by people who saw vulnerability as opportunity. But my mother's training had also been my salvation. The documentation habits she'd taught me, the law enforcement contacts she'd introduced me to, the general skepticism about human nature she'd instilled. All of it had combined to save my life when David's true intentions became clear. "I've been thinking about writing a book," I told Marcus as we watched the sunset paint the ocean in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "Not a memoir exactly, but something that combines my personal experience with the broader lessons we've learned about organ trafficking prevention." "What would you call it?" I considered the question as I sipped my wine, thinking about the journey that had brought me from a honeymoon suite in this same resort to an international platform for victim advocacy. "Harvest season," I said finally, because that's what David and people like him think they're doing, harvesting human beings like crops. But what they don't understand is that sometimes the crop fights back. The next morning, I participated in a panel discussion about the psychology of organ trafficking criminals. Dr. Valdez was also on the panel, speaking from her perspective as a former trafficking surgeon who'd been recruited by David's network during his incarceration. "The rehabilitation program requires us to understand not just what we did, but why we were able to rationalize it at the time," Dr. Valdez explained to the audience. "In my case, I convinced myself that I was providing medical services to people who needed them, without acknowledging that the quote, donors weren't truly consenting to the procedures." "What changed your perspective?" asked a delegate from the European Union. "Meeting the survivors," Dr. Valdez said simply. "Hearing from people like Ms. Martinez about the psychological impact of being targeted and betrayed by someone they trusted. It's impossible to maintain the illusion that you're helping people when you're confronted with the reality of the trauma you've caused." I found Dr. Valdez's transformation both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it suggested that even hardened criminals could develop empathy and remorse given the right circumstances. Troubling because it raised questions about how many other medical professionals were currently involved in trafficking operations without fully acknowledging the human cost of their actions. "Dr. Valdez," I said during the panel discussion, "you mentioned that David Chen provided guidance about victim selection even while incarcerated. Can you tell us more about how trafficking networks recruit medical professionals?" She looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. They target doctors who are facing financial difficulties, malpractice suits, or other professional problems. They offer what seems like legitimate consulting work, reviewing medical procedures, evaluating patient files, providing expert opinions. By the time you realize you're involved in something criminal, you're already compromised and afraid to report it. The panel discussion revealed the scope of corruption within the medical tourism industry that most people never suspected. Legitimate hospitals and clinics were being infiltrated by trafficking networks, their facilities and staff used to provide cover for illegal organ harvesting operations. After the panel ended, I was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Carmen Sandoval, a medical tourism coordinator from Guatemala. Ms. Martinez, I think one of my clients might be in danger. She's a young American woman who came to our clinic for what she said was cosmetic surgery, but something about her companion made me uncomfortable. He was asking too many questions about our surgical capabilities and privacy policies. I immediately signaled to Detective Williams, who was observing the conference from the security section. This was exactly the kind of real-time intelligence that made international conferences valuable beyond their educational purpose. Can you describe the companion? I asked Carmen as Ray joined our conversation. Mid-30s, very charming, claimed to be a pharmaceutical sales representative. He spoke perfect Spanish and seemed to know a lot about medical procedures. But he was more interested in our post-operative care facilities than the actual cosmetic surgery his girlfriend was supposedly getting. Ray and I exchanged a look. The description matched the profile of trafficking recruiters we'd been tracking across Central America. Where is this woman now? Ray asked. Still at our clinic, as far as I know. The surgery was scheduled for this afternoon, but we haven't been able to reach her since yesterday evening. Her companion said she was resting and didn't want to be disturbed. Within an hour, Ray had coordinated with Guatemalan law enforcement to conduct a welfare check at Carmen's clinic. The woman they found wasn't resting. She was heavily sedated and being prepared for organ harvesting by a team of criminals who'd infiltrated the facility, posing as legitimate medical staff. The rescue operation saved the woman's life and led to the arrest of 6 people involved in a trafficking network that had been operating across Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. It was exactly the kind of outcome that made the Guardian Protocol's work feel meaningful and necessary. As I prepared to fly back to Phoenix, I reflected on the strange symmetry of returning to the place where my nightmare had begun to help prevent others from experiencing similar trauma. The Casa Blanca Resort had been transformed from a hunting ground for organ traffickers into a symbol of international cooperation in victim protection. But the most significant transformation had been my own. The frightened woman who'd found surgical consent forms in her husband's luggage had evolved into someone who could stand in that same resort and speak confidently about turning survival into service. David's attempt to destroy me had instead created his perfect opponent, someone with intimate knowledge of his methods, unshakable determination to stop him, and the international platform to make a real difference. During the flight home, I started outlining the book I'd mentioned to Marcus. The story would begin with that moment of discovery in the honeymoon suite, but it wouldn't end with David's arrest, or even with the Guardian Protocol's success. It would end with a challenge to readers to recognize that true victory over predators comes not from punishment alone, but from prevention. The title, Harvest Season, felt more appropriate with each page I wrote. David and his associates had seen human beings as crops to be harvested when the conditions were right. But they'd made a fundamental error in their agricultural metaphor. Sometimes the intended harvest has deeper roots than expected, and sometimes fighting back creates a bigger harvest of justice than anyone could have imagined. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Rodriguez. Saw the news about the Guatemala rescue. Another life saved because you had the courage to speak your truth. The ripple effects continue to spread. I smiled as I typed back my response. The harvest continues, but now we're harvesting justice instead of organs. 10 years after David Chen tried to reduce me to spare parts, I was helping to dismantle the entire industry that had created him. The isolation and betrayal that were supposed to destroy me had instead given me the clarity and determination to fight back more effectively than any traditionally supported victim could have managed. In the end, David's greatest failure wasn't medical or logistical, it was philosophical. He'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human resilience and the power of survivor testimony. He'd tried to harvest my organs, but instead he'd harvested something far more dangerous to people like him. A witness who refused to be silenced, and a survivor who turned her trauma into other people's protection. As the plane descended into Phoenix, I looked out at the desert landscape where my mother had raised me to be strong, skeptical, and prepared for the worst aspects of human nature. Sofia Martinez had given me the tools to survive David's betrayal, but using those tools to build something larger and more meaningful had been my choice. The harvest season was far from over, but now I was the one deciding what would be gathered and what would be protected. That seemed like the most fitting conclusion to a story that had begun with someone else trying to control my fate, and had ended with me taking control of theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.